When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, pit stop. User, TRVL token 888. Posted, May 8, 1999.
Despite being 60 years old, up until last year, my mother had never seen the desert in person. What can I say? My family are not a traveling people. You know how in The Hobbit, Bilbo is related to both the Baggins and the Took families, with the Baggins half of him wanting to stay at home and the Took side craving adventure? That's me, with my mom's side of the family being the Bagginses and my dad the Tooks. I can't remember what this situation with Bilbo's parents turned out to be, but for Mom and Dad, it was a bad mix. He's been in the wind for 20 years at least, with not so much as a birthday card to let me know if he's still alive. Mom has always said she's never missed him because he left the best part of himself behind, and my childhood was a happy one. She's had to work hard for it, but we've had a good life. While I won't go so far as to flatter myself with a direct comparison to Bilbo Baggins, I will say I understand him. As long as I can remember, I felt an uneasy tension between competing desires. One half of me craves the warmth of my living room and being gently lulled to sleep by the pulse of the world outside. The other wants to vanish over the horizon, leaving the screen door banging behind me. I'd be lying if I said the latter half, the wild side, hadn't been winning the war most of the time, but never completely. Promised myself that, unlike my old man, I'd always come home, and I have. I've always tried to share my love of the wider world with the people closest to me, not in an annoying or pushy way, but in a way they can hopefully enjoy home all the more, knowing what else is out there. Most of the time, anyways. 5 years ago, in the spring of 1994, my mom lost her job at the bank to a far more frightening force than anything we'd encounter on the road later that summer: downsizing. It didn't matter she'd been there 18 years or was consistently the most relied upon employee. To the men at the top, she was a line item to be crossed out. I tried my best to help her see the bright side of the change, the room it made in her life for new opportunities, but that Baggins energy runs deep. I decided extreme measures were necessary. We were going to Las Vegas. She fought like hell at first with all the usual hearty family excuses. I can't afford it, it's too far, who will look after the house, and so on. Her trump card for avoiding seeing the world with me had always been, work won't give me the time off. So once I knocked down her other objections, I could afford to pay for us both as long as she could cover her own food. There's no such thing as too far if you have gas money, and it's a house, it'll be fine. She didn't have a fallback. She had to agree. If marathon driving sessions are your thing, the drive from Nashua to Vegas can be done in 3 or 4 days. It's an idiotic way to do it unless you're hauling a cooler full of black market organs or something, but hey, if that's your thing, go for it. The trip I wanted to take Mom on was more laid back. 7 days there, 3 days in Sin City, 7 days home. I won't bore you with the details of our trip there and the time we spent in the city, except to say Mom loved it. There was only one dark spot on the entire trip. One lone ant marching on the white tablecloth of our time together, and that was the pit stop. Despite having traveled back and forth across the United States several times since I first upped stakes and gave in to my inner took, I have had exactly 0 problems. That's not to say I don't think bad things can happen out there, just that until the truck stop, my inner compass seemed to have been perfectly calibrated to avoid any and all danger. If I'm making one of these trips by myself, I do my best to avoid interstates wherever possible. Life is just more interesting on the back roads. That said, when you need to make a pit stop off the beaten path, it can require becoming okay with, shall we say, a diminished level of comfort and/or cleanliness. Because of this, for most of my trip with Mom, I kept us on the interstate except for one stretch where Nevada bleeds into Utah. We heard on the radio that a multi-car pileup had stopped traffic for miles in each direction, so I steered us off onto county roads before we ended up spending the afternoon baking while we waited for the highway to clear. I'll admit it, I got us lost. It was pure arrogance on my part, a total conviction I could tell which direction we were heading by dead reckoning alone. Most of the time, this is something I could actually do, but these dusty back roads completely confounded me. When we rolled up on the truck stop, the day was hot as hell and had been for what felt like hours, during which time the sun barely seemed to move. The truck stop itself had at one point been white with red trim. Now it was sort of a phlegm yellow, the red like ribbons of blood. Shabby though it may have been, it wasn't the worst place I'd seen in my travels. I parked the car in front of what had used to be a diner, but was now a cavernous vacancy with soaked-over windows. The pumps looked to still be operational, and I could see lights on inside the gas station, meaning it was a safe bet the bathrooms, signposted as being around the corner, were still open too. I went around first, finding an even larger cracked asphalt parking lot out back. In the rear of the station were 2 red doors marked his and hers. I gave the his door a gentle push, and sure enough, it swung open with a creak. Mom was similarly successful with hers, so we separated to do our business. Inside, the bathroom continued the truck stop's so far unbroken streak of being far from the filthiest place I'd found in my travels. It may have been the quietest, though. The second the door closed, it was like being on the moon. Once I was done, I turned on the hot water tap to wash my hands, and that's when a feeling of dread pressed down on my chest so hard my vision darkened at the edges. Even though I only just turned 27, for a second there I was convinced I was having a heart attack. Then I realized this wasn't it at all. This was coming from outside of me. I was alone in the bathroom, that much I knew for sure, because the door hadn't creaked again while I was using the toilet. So what was it? Why did I feel like something was about to smash my head to pieces against the streaked mirror? There was a sound, paper on paper, a dry, sliding whistle like something ancient was shedding its skin. My heart froze. That internal compass I mentioned earlier finally caught up with the situation and whirled, a little too late for my comfort. something was deeply, deeply wrong. All I knew for sure was that if I didn't move right now, I might never be leaving that place. And so I bolted for the door, ripping it open so hard, I'm pretty sure it loosened the hinges. The first thing I saw once I got outside was my mom in the front seat of the car, which she must have pulled around back. The second thing was her frantically waving me toward it. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but there was no mistaking the movement of her mouth. She was screaming, "Run!" That's exactly what I did, my sneakers skidding on the old lot's loose asphalt. Her eyes were so wild that once I got my hand around the passenger door's handle, I thought she might just take off. Indeed, she ground the car to a halt, just long enough for me to climb in, then hit the accelerator and we fishtailed our way out of the lot. She managed to do a better job than I had of getting us back to the state highway, although I was certain that there were more signs now than there had been an hour ago. It doesn't seem possible, yet I'd almost bet on it. Once we'd put a good 10 miles between us and that truck stop, I asked Mom how she'd gotten back to the car and moved it so quickly. She looked away from the road long enough to give me an uncertain glance. A few more miles rolled by, then she told me that as she was walking into the bathroom, she'd heard her mother's voice, barely more than a whisper. It had told her she needed to get to the car now, to be ready because when I came out, something terrible would be at my heels, and to outrun it, we'd have to move fast. She stopped speaking, and we sat in silence as the mile markers whipped by. Neither of us had ever seen anything come out of that bathroom, and we've never discussed our behavior that day, our need to get away quickly. There was one simple reason for this. The woman who had issued that warning, my mother's mother, had been dead almost 2 decades. It was an unspoken agreement between us. What had happened, and we weren't going to talk about it again, now or ever.
Subject 4. User 15 ET Zanon. Posted June 14th, 1996.
Nothing will rattle you like gunshots you're not expecting. I'm not a gun owner myself, but growing up in the sticks in East Texas, you hear enough rifles being fired, you don't think much of it unless you're downrange. Pistol fire, that's a different beast, and more than a few of them at any given time is bad news, no two ways about it. Should you hear them after midnight when you and your wife are trying to sleep in a house you already think might be haunted, say goodbye to whatever sleep you might have been planning to get. It turned out that the shooting had come from a couple state troopers getting into it with some fugitives at a traffic stop, a fact we learned from the morning news. Thinking about it, we were better off not knowing what was going on at the time because, like I said before, we've been having some issues with the new house, and adding on concern about intruders on the land would have been unbearable. At that time, we'd only been in the house 3 months, and we were starting to worry we'd made a mistake. My wife Susie and I had both grown up in cramped little houses, shacks really, and when we started seriously planning for a future together, the first thing on our lists had been a nice, big house on a real piece of land. I didn't know how we'd get there or what we'd do with the land once it was ours, but we figured it would all come together. The house is a 2-bedroom, 3-bath ranch style on 10 acres outside of Tyler with our own pecan trees and a pond, no less. Price-wise, it was on the high end of what we could afford, though it was cheaper than other similarly sized parcels we'd looked at. When I asked the realtor why that was, she bobbed and weaved for a bit before admitting that there had been a procession of owners who'd come and gone. She pointed to the odd, slightly ramshackle construction of the house itself, which you can clearly tell began life as a single-room cabin that was built onto over the years. If I had to guess, the room we've adopted as our bedroom room was the original structure, with all the additions piled on from there. Again, at the time, it was a good enough explanation, even though I'm now sure it was a damned lie. Susie and I can't have kids. We wanted them, but that's the hand God dealt us. Adoption was on the table until we ran the numbers and realized we were going to be house poor for at least a few years. It was a tough pill to swallow. Then the ghost stuff started, and we couldn't help wondering if our delayed parenthood might not have been part of a larger plan. Let me explain. The availability of the house wasn't what sold us on it, not really. Even our first impressions of the property were that a profound sadness had settled deep into its bones. The whole yard was overgrown and wild, tall grass ringing the pond so thoroughly it was barely visible. I could understand why people had passed it by. It took walking in the front door for Susie and I to fall for the place. We felt this solid, satisfying click like a key in a lock, as if this was the place we were meant to be, whatever the cost. We'd been there a week when Susie asked me where I'd put her art supplies, and I said I hadn't touched them. Susie runs the office for a large machine shop in town, but in her time off, she likes to paint. Some of those brushes and colors are not cheap, and I wouldn't move them under pain of certain death, so if they weren't in her studio, I had no idea where they'd be. They turned up a couple days later in the middle of the living room as if they'd just suddenly appeared. It didn't make any kind of logical sense, so we just pushed it out of our minds. The next thing was harder to ignore. Susie and I were in bed, fooling around, when she stiffened right up. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her face suddenly serious. I hadn't and told her so. She held a finger up as if signaling me to wait, and in the silence, I heard it, giggling. It sounded like young girls giggling from outside the door to our room. Susie was scared, the for real kind of scared, the sort of fear that only takes the softest push to turn into terror. I hopped off the bed and moved toward the bedroom door. The only possible explanation was that some neighborhood kids had snuck in and had caught us in the act. At least, that's what I told myself. Looking back at that night, I half wonder if I didn't understand on some level what was really going on. Because I went up to that door bare naked. If I actually thought there were some underage pervert burglars waiting for me the other side of that door, I'd like to think I'd have at least put on some boxer shorts. The giggling was steady now. Susie had pulled the covers up around her neck, hissing at me to be careful. I nodded, slowly reaching toward the door before suddenly gripping the handle and yanking it open. The laughter stopped as if a switch had been flipped. I'd never considered the possibility that silence could be so loud, yet that's exactly how the entire house felt for the rest of the night. You couldn't help but feel drowned out by the emptiness. I searched the house, checking every door, window, closet, and cubbyhole, coming up with nothing and no one. Neither of us slept much that night. Corralling all the overgrowth in the backyard took near a month of Sundays. Neither of us are the work-shy types either. That tall grass was just hardy as hell. Being able to properly see the pond once it was done made all that sweat and sunburn worth it, though. Before long, it became apparent we weren't the only ones who thought so. It was August, and I was out sitting on a lawn chair out back in the shade of the pecan trees when I thought I saw something white moving quickly out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, nothing was there, but then it kept repeating, each time disappearing when I looked straight at it. I decided to avoid turning and try to see as much as I could out of the corner of my eye. The flashes continued, brief flickers seeming to grow closer the more I pretended to ignore them. Finally, the flashes coalesced into something I could vaguely see. A single, solitary image, one of a young girl in a plain white dress, her long brown hair cascading down around her shoulders. Having seen it, I couldn't help looking, and as soon as I did, she was gone. There hadn't been any feeling of malice to the experience, so I raised my beer in the direction of where she'd been standing. In retrospect, my intention to avoid telling Susie about the sightings was laughable. Something was clearly making itself known to us, even if we didn't understand what or why. More sounds followed, always after dark, sweeping, clicking, running feet, and because we had no context for any of it, it would keep us up, sometimes till sunrise. Then, in October, we were startled out of bed by the traffic stop gunshots, and it all came together. We both leapt out of bed, heading to the nearest window to try and see where the shots were coming from. In the excitement, I stubbed my toe hard on the baseboard and felt a flare of pain so intense I completely missed the Woods dry snap. It was Susie who noticed it the following morning. "Hey, hon, you see this?" She gestured toward the broken board. I shook my head. "Nah, but I bet that's from me hitting it last night." She poked at the brake. "Should be easy enough to fix." "For me to fix, you mean?" She chuckled. "You broke it, you buy it, slick." The wood floor creaked underneath me as I walked toward the bathroom. I was about to close the door behind me when Susie called my name. "Roman, there's something in here." "In where?" I called back. "The baseboard, come take a look." I sauntered back into the bedroom. Susie was still kneeling down, but the baseboard was now pulled back, exposing a small hidey hole she had fully stuck her hand into. "You're gonna get yourself bit, my love." "By what?" I shrugged. "I don't know, whatever lives in walls." She responded by sticking her hand further in, a look of concentration on her face. "I've got it." "Got what?" Susie pulled her hand out, and I could see she was holding a small case, maybe half the size of a cigar box. It was made of a light-colored wood, pecan, I'd wager, and looked to be light. She stood and placed the box on her comforter. There were no hinges anywhere on the case, but a thin lip ran around the outside. Susie slipped her fingers into that groove and gently pulled. With a soft pop, the top of the case slid upward. I leaned over her just in time to see the lid pull away completely, revealing what looked like two pieces of paper so old that bordered on ancient. Susie rubbed her chin thoughtfully before saying, "This better be a treasure map." I smiled and kissed her neck. "There's only one way to find out." She shrugged. "I guess so. It's so old, though. If it falls apart, it's your fault, okay?" "That's fair. You're absolved. Come on, open it." Susie reached in and carefully extracted and folded sheets so far past yellow they were in the process of turning brown. Bits of the paper crumbled at her touch, no matter how slowly she moved, until finally they were laid out on the bed in front of us. There were two of them. The top sheet was text, the bottom was a sketch, charcoal from the look of it. Susie read the words first, and I felt her shaking against me, tiny sobs. The first page fell down to the bed, leaving the charcoal in full view. It was surprisingly good considering the bluntness of the material and the age of the paper. The drawing depicted 3 young girls of different ages holding hands. Each of them wore a white dress, the long brown hair tumbling down around their shoulders. The same feeling that had convinced us to buy the house, the inevitability of fate tumbling into place, settled down inside of me. I knew what to expect before even reading the paper, why 2 childless lovers had come to this empty place. It had children of its own who needed love. It was impossible to say how long they'd been alone, unable to connect their hearts to those of the owners who'd come before us. I held Susie close and picked up the first page. Reading it, I understood at last there had never been any reason to be afraid of the things happening in our home. They belonged there as much as we did. This is what it said. We have always been here, where the tall grass sways without wind and the air is heavy and silent, as though before a storm. Mornings the same, brightness creeping through our cottage's open door. We rise from dreamless sleep on straw pallets, stirring motes of dust into the light. After breakfast, Isabel sweeps the floor, corn bristles scraping the planks clean. Maggie knits, clicking needles mending that which is worn. I watch over them both. In the afternoon, we run in the fields, breathlessly playing hide and seek, our laughter rising above the whisper of dried grass. We have been alone together so long. Our memories are withered. What is left comes through like bursts of static from distant stars, an embrace, tears, the sound of rain. Once upon a time, we sought escape from this place, this life, by rope, by knife, by stone, and we came by violence unto peace. Yet every time we woke again, rising from our pallets to find the bodies where they dropped and our world unchanged. Now death has become our companion, the 4th sister in our forever, and the only thing we still fear is that we may outlive her too. We run past the pecan tree where, dried by the sun, we hang. 3 pretty parchment scarecrows in white linen dresses. Down the hill to the pond, we skip across our own backs, white linen lily pads, our long, flaxen hair streaming in clear water into the vastness of a world we did not create and do not understand. Into straw and dust and silence and the smell of wildfire when the moon is full, where the sugarcane sways without wind and the air is heavy and silent, as though before a storm. We have always been here.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.